Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel simply is Discerning What is True. Today is the 21st day of February 2026. I'm going to be reading from a book by John Coleman. The book is simply called Abortion, Genocide in America. The nation's leadership fails litmus tests on abortion. The most vital, important test or issue in U.S. history. This was written back, I think, in the 1980s. Is that correct? And so we'll just begin to read what he has said here. In the scholarly work by Dr. Coleman, he explains in detail why, notwithstanding Roe versus Wade, abortion in the United States remains unconstitutional and unlawful. The leading cause of death in the U.S. is not what the American Medical Association says it is, but rather it is infanticide. Let me change something real quick here to make it easier for me to read. It is known as abortion, which the AMA does not bother to list in its annual statistics after searching 37,000 pages of the annuals of Congress, the Congressional Globe, and the Congressional Record. The author says he was not able to find anything in the Constitution that would legalize abortion. Dr. Coleman cites the late Senator Sam Ervin, E-R-V-I-N, a great constitutionalist, as saying, in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court found a power in the U.S. Constitution that does not even exist. The leading threats to the maintenance and stability of the The leading threat to the maintenance and stability of our Republican form of government and our rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights are abortion and gun control in that order, says Dr. Coleman. The Supreme Court justice who voted for abortion acted outside the pale, P-A-L-E, and the king, K-E-N, of the Constitution. Abortion is a product of so-called, quote, free love, end quote, which now permeates every corner of the United States. Now, this is written older. Now, remember that it's no longer Roe and Wade. Now it's unconstitutional. We need to still talk about why this happened, okay? Why did this happen? Well, something happened in the 60s, and I wanted to say this. The idea simply is what we call free love. Basically, no responsibilities. Just man and a woman getting together and basically getting involved in sexual events. I won't go any further than that. But the point simply is they didn't take responsibility for the child. They were not ready to have children, you see. They were what we call not innocent, but foolish. Women are murdering their babies at the alarming rate, and the unholy state of affairs must be halted, even if the Second American Revolution has to be fought to put an end to it, the author says. This book is recommended to every person who has had any regard for the Constitution, and Dr. Coleman believes that relentlessly opposition to abortion must be forcibly expressed until Congress overturns Roe versus Wade, which it has the power to do, even by a majority of one single vote. So chapter 1 is called The Leading Cause of Death in America. That'll be the chapter we'll deal today. There's also, we'll go into the other chapters here later as I continue to read from the book. The leading cause of death in America is not what the American Medical Association, AM, says it is, but infanticide, known as abortion, which the AMA does not even bother to include in its annual statistics. In other words, they don't even think it's important. Let me continue. After searching 37,000 pages of the annuals of Congress, the Congressional Globe and Congressional Record, a task I began in 1971, and after having spent 5 years of intense study of the U.S. Constitution, I can say that there is no power for abortion found in the U.S. Constitution. For a measure to be constitutional, it must first be studied to see if such a power already exists in the U.S. Constitution. That is to say, expressed or expressly implied or in consonance with or pursuant to existing power. If no such power is found, then the measure falls to the ground and cannot be taken up. As Senator Sam Ervin told me in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court found a power in the U.S. Constitution that does not even exist. The leaders of the conservationists, or conservatism that is, and defenders of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, bowing to pressure from Henry Hyde, Newt Gingrich, Jim Nicholson, and Richard Riordan, the delegates to the Republican Party National Committee Convention held at Palm Springs in January of 1998, voted against the courageous resolution submitted by Tim Lambert, Lambert, chairman of the Texas Homeschooling Coalition, and backed by the Citizen Christian Coalition. Lambert resolution was for the was for the Republican Party to cut off funding for candidates who would not support a ban on late-term abortions. The gruesome ritual murder of children who are wrenched from the mother's womb, their heads crushed, and their brains sucked out. Those of the party hierarchy with an eye to the upcoming elections who regarded the collection of filthy ludicrous of greater importance than ending the cruel, horrifying murder of helpless infants, use all manner of rhetoric to persuade delegates not to split the party. The most compelling assertion came from Representative Henry Hyde. There is no reason I am in Congress either other than to fight for the unborn child. Okay. The worst thing you can do for the pro-life movement is for us to lose our majority. We need people to pass laws. We need converts. If you read these people out of the party, they will never come over to our side. In other words, the guys in fear didn't stand up for what's right. You see. As it well known to World in Review subscribers, Henry Hyde helped to pass, quote, laws, end quote, that were absolutely unconstitutional, such as HR stands for House Resolution 1710, HR 2580, again, House Resolution, not to mention his almost jocular attitude towards Waco. Remember Waco, don't you? You know what took place there, don't you? You do know that, don't you? You know the military killed those people, don't you? And they made what's his name, some type of a very bad guy, and they forced their way. In other words, what happened at Waco, the Branch Davidians, is that I don't agree with their belief, but that's not the point. Okay. The point simply is the military went in there to show their force. And the power of the government used all types of military weapons to destroy them. That was Attorney General Janet Reno. Hyde was an example of the kind of people the Republican Party wished to keep as leaders. Then those who value principle above expediency should form their own party as for, quote, new converts. And then in brackets, and many long-time members, how many of them who do not oppose child murder can be counted upon to vote for true conservative measures when the chips are down and when the big push comes to utter and destroy the people's Second Amendment rights? How many of these, quote, new converts, end quote, and moderates, end quote, in the party will stand up and be counted on the side of defending the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? The question is self-evident. Will they desert the people in droves for the sake of expediency, or will they uphold their oath of office? If experience is anything to go by, don't count on the moderates, end quote, in the Republican Party to do the right thing. In fact, don't, and I'll just say this right now, don't count for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party to do a damn thing. Okay? I'm going to get this on my mind here. I'm going to say something really critical. You people who continue to vote for these people who do harm to this country, and they're both in the same political party, Republicans and Democrats, are part of the problem. Okay? You need to understand that. It'd be better you never even voted for these people. They're despicable, all of them. How sad that the leadership of the Republican Party today has fallen to a slot. They wobble around as if we compare them with congressmen of the period of 1880 to 1900. And I assume he's talking about probably the progressives. It is hard to believe just how far in quality the representatives of the people have fallen. Randy Tate, T-A-T-E, director of Christian Coalition, put it in perspective when he said, quote, "We had hoped that the Republican Party would lead, but if they will not, then we invite them to follow as we take the lead," end quote. Former Speaker of the House, that's right, Newt Gingrich, talked of a tactical mistake, end quote, end quote. If the resolution not to fund those who favor child murder were carried, what kind of a leader is this when what was at stake, condoning or opposing child murder, could be described in terms of, quote, tactics? In my opinion, the major problem of the Republican Party is that, with a few notable exceptions, is bereft of men of true leadership. Instead, the party is top-heavy with hierarchy politicians more concerned with their own welfare and their pursuit of success than with principles. Yeah, they don't have any principles. The only principle they look for is their money and having, getting money from the stock exchange and all that kind of crap. They do all this kind of trading underneath people. They know they always do this crap, folks. They're nothing but deceivers. That's my point. Especially the principle of upholding and defending the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Two greatest threats to the maintenance and stability of our Republican form of government, that's another key, folks. It's a republic, not a democracy. They destroyed that also back in the early 1900s with, let's see, what was that president name? Oh, yes, right, Wilson. Woodrow Wilson. And during the states used to choose, I don't even know if anybody even knows this anymore. The states used to pick the senators. Okay? It was not. This is about states' rights, folks. This is not about elections. This was about states' rights to give power to the states. They destroyed that. They gave it to the voters to do that, you see. Republican form of government is based upon what we call having the states having the power to deal with the national power, which is a threat to all of us, okay? So the Supreme Court, Republican Party, and our national rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights are abortion and gun control. So the Supreme Court justices who voted for abortion acted outside the pale and ken of the Constitution when they said the Fourth Amendment right to privacy, that is, quote, right, end quote, right, could be interpreted as rights, R-I-G-H-T-S, end quote, of a woman to abort her unborn child. In my 5 years of study at the British Museum in London, which included a study of ancient nations and their cultures, I have never found a nation among them that willingly permitted the mass murder of their children. In fact, even the Egyptian and Babylonian priesthood did not practice mass murder of children. They murdered only selected victims for ritual sacrifice purposes. The priesthood of those nations could do this because of their power and wealth arising from their alleged, quote, higher secret knowledge, end quote. The people of Egypt did not dare to disobey the priest's rules until the reign of Amenhotep, which is the fourth, in the 18th dynasty. It is utterly beyond explanation why the American people allowed the liberal, quote, priestcraft, end quote, and the politicians, I should say politicos, I should say, they control, along with the, quote, priestesses, end quote, of the Supreme Court with their alleged, quote, higher knowledge, end quote, of the Constitution, to go on murdering children at the rate of 1.4 million a year for reasons of being inconvenient to take responsibility for sexual unions. The, quote, free love doctrine of Madame I'm going to spell it to you because I don't know how to pronounce it. Kollontai, who lived from 1872 to 1952. The Bolshevik commissioner who toured the U.S. in the 1920s preaching the doctrine of sex without responsibility. I bet you never even heard of this person, have you? I haven't. Never heard of her. She was a Bolshevik, a communist. That's what a communist is, folks. It's a commissar. Quote, free love, end quote, is a drug permitting every corner of our nation, and it has now got an entire generation of women hooked. While in this mentally drugged and mind control induced state, that's true, folks. People are completely drugged up. They don't know they're up or down. And we live in a mind control state too. Women are murdering their own unborn infants at a staggering rate. This unholy state of affairs is unconscionable, and must be halted, even if it means we have to fight a Second Amendment, Second American Revolution, put an end to this savagery. As I hope to demonstrate, abortion is unconstitutional, and we must stand fast on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as the highest law of the land. We must wage relentlessly opposition by whatever means possible under the law against those who are violating it. Kollontai, I'm just going to spell it to you. Kollontai book, The Origin of the Family, that's the name of the book, is a sharp attack on the sanity of marriage and the family. It is the handbook of the so-called women's rights movement in America, although most protagonists of the movement have probably heard of it. Supreme Court justices are not immune from political influence, and it seems to me that political pressure was behind the passage of Roe versus Wade. Now, people say, well, why are you talking about this? Roe and Wade's been just now no longer a part of it. No, I want to read this book because it's important for people to understand what went on in the past, okay? It is a flaw in our system whereby Supreme Court justices are proposed by the president, and it goes without saying that the political beliefs of the president must undoubtedly influence his choice. Chapter 2. The Constitution is immutable. The great thing to remember is that the Constitution cannot be fragmented, nor can its clauses be isolated. See, it's supposed to be looked at in a whole. The Constitution has to be seen as a whole. Otherwise, its perfect equipoise is lost. There is absolutely no connection between the Fourth Amendment, right to privacy, and abortion rights. Okay. The Ninth Amendment was written as a restriction upon the federal government to stop them reading their predications between the lines of the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment clearly avoids any pretended connection between abortion and rights and the Fourth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment avoided the old rule of law. Another point I wish to impose here. A 9-judge Supreme Court cannot possibly meet the needs of a country the size of the United States. We need at least 50 such judges on the Supreme Court, and I venture to suggest that if there were more justices when Roe versus Wade would rule on by the court, instead of being submitted as a constitutional amendment, it would have been referred to the legislative branch immediately where it rightly belongs. In other words, that's where it's supposed to take place at. It wasn't supposed to take place in the Supreme Court. So the abortion issue is a matter for the people of the United States to decide, and this can only be done through an amendment to the Constitution ratified by all of the states. The bottom line is that the Supreme Court acted as legislators. Correct, they did. They definitely did. They stepped out of bounds. It was none of their business in Roe versus Wade, and no court in the land has the power to do so. Moreover, such justices ought to, in other words, it's also a way the legislature didn't stand up and say, the Congress didn't say, hey, excuse me, you don't have that power. You don't. Moreover, such justice ought to be elected by the people of each state and not by the president. And even as such appointments are supposed to be confirmed by the Senate. The Supreme Court, as presently constituted, does not represent the American people. The Constitution does not mean what the Supreme Court says it means. You see, that's how they can flip this switch, folks. Why do you think things change in the Supreme Court? Think about that. Oh, wait a minute. Excuse me. We have a different mode today. 20 years, 50 years down the road, we don't think this is a good idea. So now we're going to, slash this out. See, it's based upon the modes of the public or populace, or it may not be. It may be just a moment of their own modes thinking they're right and everybody else is wrong. So they see themselves as superior. The Supreme Court made abortion the law, although the power of abortion is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, nor is it a consonant with existing powers that is already in the Constitution, that is, nor is abortion expressly implied. Abortion is a prohibition and can never be the law of the land, nor could Justice Rehnquist and his colleagues point to one single word in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights where abortion is expressed or expressly implied. The abortionists went to the Supreme Court to press their case when it should have been taken up by the Congress, correct? Abortion, in any case, would be a matter for the state under the 10th Amendment, called, quote, police powers, end quote, of the states to regulate health, welfare, and police protection of the people of the states. The 10th Amendment was written to keep the federal government from interfering in such matters. Their damn business. The appendix of the congressional record, that is in June 30th, 1890, page 696. Were Mr. Jefferson here today, he would tell this House that judges appointed to office on account of their political views and holding the office from and looking to preferment of the hands of the party in power will in many cases be influenced by political bias. I am sensible of the inroads daily taking the federal government into the jurisdiction of the coordinates the state governments. The judicial branch is the instrument which, working like gravity without intermission, is to press us at last into one consolidated mass. If Congress fails to shield the states from dangers so palpable and so imminent, then the states must shield themselves and meet the invader, foot to foot. In March 4, 1832, Mr. Jefferson, that is the president once was, wrote to Judge Johnson, and in closing the letter, he said, I cannot lay down my pen without referring to one of the subjects of my former letter. For the truth is there is no danger I apprehend so much as the consolidation of our government by the noiseless and therefore unalarming instrumentality of the Supreme Court. And with no body of men is this restraint more warranted than with the judges of what is commonly called the, quote, general government, but what I call our foreign department. They are practicing upon the Constitution by inference, analogy, and sophism, as they would on ordinary law. But it has proved that the power of declaring the law ad libitum by sapping and mining slowly and without alarm the foundations of the Constitution can do what open forums would not dare to attempt. I am not observed whether in your code you have provided against causing judicial decisions and for judges to give their opinions surrounding them. Every man for himself, end quote. In the foregoing is found all of the tenets that went into the Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade, and with it the much wider implications that not only did the court purport to allow infants to be aborted, but the Supreme Court on that day aborted also the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. One of the worst disasters ever to befall the United States was the passing by the Supreme Court of Roe versus Wade, which purportedly makes abortions legal. It behooves us to take stock of just where we are at and what road we are at as a nation would travel in the next 50 years. The following is a chronology of how the crime of child murder became legal. In 1973, Roe versus Wade. Norma McCorva, alias Doe, D-O-E, was used by the radical feminist inheritors of the Communist Hull House, that is feminists of the Roosevelt era, to claim at her constitutional, quote, right, a, quote, right, end quote, to abortion on demand. Instead of refusing to hear the case on the grounds that Congress and not the Supreme Court make the laws, the court ruled 7-2 that abortion was a right and not a crime. You never even heard of this, have you? I haven't. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote the following words that sent the Grim Reaper riding across the land to reap a harvest of millions of tiny, mangled corpses, most defenseless of the defenseless, slaughtered with no one to help them. The right to privacy, that is, in brackets, the Fourth Amendment, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Blackmun had not one shred of constitutional evidence to support his preposterous position. And in my opinion, at that moment, the man took leave of his senses, or else his simplistic interpretation was taken directly from the Communist Manifesto of 1848. What Blackmun did, and for which he should have been removed from the bench, was to stretch and squeeze the Constitution to fit his own predations that is forbidden by the Ninth Amendment, which is aimed against judges doing just that. On that day, not only were infant babies denied the right to life, liberty, and property under the Constitution, and in brackets for children, follow the condition of the parents, in bracket, but the Constitution was mangled the way their tiny corpses were soon to be mangled. Henceforth, not only discarded aborted babies would be consigned to dumpsters in back alleys, but also the Constitution. Roe versus Wade was not a matter for the jurisdiction of the court, but solely a matter for the Congress, since the courts have no constitutional powers to legislate. Excuse me. Only Congress could have passed a constitutional amendment, which would have first gone to the states for ratification. Only then would abortion have become law. But a cowardly Congress ducked the issue and allowed the Supreme Court to usurp the function of the lawmakers. Lawmakers, right. Thereby permitting the court to find a power in the Constitution which did not exist and has never existed. It reminded me of so much of the time when President Woodrow Wilson, yes, that's right, that dumbass, was working to send thousands of young American soldiers to their death on the European battlefields in World War I. By the way, the word dumbass is my word, not his word. Okay, Wilson is by far the worst president we've ever had. By far. He's done immense damage because he was a progressive. And that's why they had two other candidates running also against him. And that's how he won, you see. He would not have won with another candidate. He would have lost. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt ran, Bull Moose Party. But admitted that he had no authority to conscript the militia or military service abroad. Congress recognized that it had no authority to send the militia to Europe. Thereupon, quote, gave permission, in brackets, for Wilson to do so in flagrant violation of the Constitution. In brackets, for further reading, please see my book, quote, What You Should Know About the U.S. Constitution, end quote. The mental quixotism of the Supreme Court somehow stretched the Fourth Amendment to include a woman's right to have abortion, just as Wilson stretched his non-existent presidential powers to order the conscripted militia to fight in Europe. Let's remember something. Did anybody attack the United States? Excuse me. Hello? Did anybody come over here and blow bombs up? Did they come over here with their Navy, military, the Army? Did they come over here and attack the United States? No, they didn't. They never did. They never did in the Second World War neither. Although Roosevelt, it made it much easier for moving that's right, the Navy used to be in San Diego, California. That's right. And they moved it to Hawaii and Honolulu and Pearl Harbor to make it easier for the Japanese to come and attack the United States. It was a bait because we were doing all kinds of bad things to Japan even at that point. Okay. We wanted them to fight. Okay. The Supreme Court, in so doing, violated the Ninth Amendment, which expressly forbids judges from writing their predilections into law. The court was guilty of violating the Fifth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, and the 10th Amendments with its ruling Roe versus Wade. And Congress should have assembled at once to overturn this grave assault on the Constitution, which it has the power to do. In 1973, Roe versus Wade rulings brought a whole new industry, bloody charm houses complete with a lexicon of newspeak language such as, quote, health providers, end quote, trimsters, in quotes, quote, family planning, in quotes, clinics, pro-choice, reproductive rights, Planned Parenthood, reproductive health services, clinic escorts, end quote, contraceptives, end quote, reproduction decisions, end quote, reproductive freedom, end quote, and an infinitum. In 1973, Doe versus Bolton. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court struck down a Georgia state law that a doctor must concur with a woman's decision to have an abortion during the first trimester, end quote. That is 3 months of pregnancy. This was yet to further violations of the 10th Amendment, which declares emphatically that such matters reside with the states and that the central government cannot interfere in health and family matters, which are outside of the jurisdictions of the central government. Of course it is. By its Doe versus Bolton ruling, the Supreme Court was indicating that it would brook no attacks on its road to Wade ruling, an attitude which it has remained staunchly wedded ever since. What it meant by, quote, police powers, end quote, shorthand, so often used to describe the provisions of the 10th Amendment. Quote, police powers consist of health, welfare, education, family matters, state laws, and police protection. They're always collectively referred to as police powers of the states. Clearly, these rights are state rights and cannot be infringed upon or inferred with by the central government, as the states never relinquished their rights over such matters when they joined the Union. Pomeroy, the great Constitution, said in his work, Constitutional Law, quote, those affairs which are local affect the citizens in his private capacity under the Constitution has to do with private and personal rights and not the federal government, abstracted from his relations to the whole political system, are managed by the separate state governments which were found in existence and left remaining by the same Constitution. In addition, we have, that is, no power is conferred by the Constitution upon the Congress to establish mere police regulations within the states. That was from 9 Wallace 41. 14 Howard 17. The power to make municipal regulations, that is in brackets, state laws, for the restraint and punishment of crimes for the preservation of health and the morals of her citizens has never been surrendered by the states or restrained by the Constitution of the United States. In the 1976 Planned Parenthood of Central Missouri versus Danford, in a 5-4 ruling, the court struck down a state law which said that the father or parents, wait a minute, let's just see what's going on here, folks. Okay, you have state laws. When does the U.S. get involved in all this crap? Okay, you got to ask yourself, all right, why is the federal government getting involved? Well, the reason what's happened simply, I can explain this. It's not in this book, but I'll tell you. The reason why this happened simply is that what happened after the war between the states. You see, the South was for what we call more of what we call states' rights, far more than the Union was ever involved. In fact, the Union wanted what we call a bigger form of government. The South didn't want that. In fact, if you've lived in the South, there's at one time it was far less government. It's now completely changed. But at one time, it was far less everything. You know, it was not this total bureaucracy that's all over the place. So we keep doing it here. So the court struck down a state law and that the father or parents of an unborn child had the right to prevent abortion taking place. Of course they do, because it's, husband and wife. This outright assault on, quote, equal under the law, end quote, gave special rights to women and denied them to men and the unborn infant. Do you see what's going on here? It's a way of actually destroying the family also, isn't it? Very clever. Very clever. One of the most hideous but seldom commented upon outcomes of the Roe versus Wade ruling. Here again, the court legislated as there is no provision in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that would allow discrimination, giving special rights to the mother of the child, and denying the father the right to protect the life of his child, and denying the child his right to protection under the Fifth Amendment. In this case, the Fifth Amendment was once again violated, violently assaulted. You see, when you become husband and wife, you're now a union. Okay? And what that means in some ways is that you have individual rights within that group. But, you have to have a suitor in order to have a child. Okay? So you have to have a daddy. You have to have a mommy. Okay? So what this does simply is that, and I understand that simply the mother is the one who has the child. Okay? I understand that. So it's not putting down women here. It's not what the point. But the point simply, there would not be a child unless there is a man around. Okay. All right. So this is like, it's almost as though they chose to do this in a way they had no right to even get involved in this at all. Federal government had no business involved in this. It should have stopped in Missouri and said, that's it. Over. Nobody knows this shit, you see. Bellotti versus Blair, this is in 1979. In a unanimous decision, the court struck down a Massachusetts law which allowed parents of minors to prevent them from having abortions, as can be seen by the foregoing case as well as those which were to follow. The Supreme Court was carrying out, almost to the letter, the policy of, quote, free love, end quote, that is, sexual relationship without responsibility. This was introduced by the Soviet Commissar, Madame Coleman, in her tour during the U.S. in the 1920s. One thing which stands out like a lighthouse on a dark night is that abortion, also known as, quote, free love, end quote, is a doctrine of the communists. Here again, in this ruling, the 10th Amendment was ripped to shreds by the Supreme Court. This was a unanimous decision. This wasn't even close. This was a unanimous decision. The court shut down a Massachusetts law. It was unanimous, 9-0. You have parents for a reason, folks. Okay, let's get to the point. They are supposed to be more mature than a child. Okay, and you have a parents because that is the responsibility of the parents. And so when you have minors means simply they are not seen in the public eye, so to speak. What I mean is simply is mommy and daddy are until the child becomes 18 years old. Okay. And so what's happening here is so the minors, it simply is that they're saying, oh, wait, they have privileges too. You see, hey. Okay. But then they don't. You see, they have special rights, but the parents don't have special rights. Hello. It's bias. In 1979, Coleman Colutti versus Franklin. In this case, the court struck down a Pennsylvania law by a margin of 6-3 that a doctor is duty-bound to save the life of an aborted baby. If the doctor believed that the life of the child could be saved, am I dreaming, or is this a nightmare really taking place in the United States? May God forgive us. Here's the most diabolical law, which says, quote, "Doctor, don't you dare go to the aid of that baby struggling and wriggling, grasping for air, his tiny fists clenched in agony, clinging to life, having somehow miraculously survived your every attempt to kill it," end quote. What kind of person would walk by a wounded dog without attempting to render assistance? See, this is also destroying what we call heart. This is about heart, folks. This is about your heart chakra. Hello? It's about your heart chakra. If you don't care, guess what? Hell will come. That's the key. If you do not care for others or yourself, things will get really rough. Because there are people out here in the world who don't give a damn about you. That's why you have a heart chakra. That's why you have feelings to help someone if someone's in trouble. If you're not, you don't have a heart chakra. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is having a heart chakra. But when you forfeit that right, what's the point, you see? What kind of person would walk by a wounded? I said that. Perhaps people are martial. What this is about is the powers that be that are in control of this world want you to shut down your heart chakra. Do not care about people. Do not care about your children. That's what makes humans humans, supposedly, okay? What kind of a person will, okay, so I'm getting all around here. So people are marshaled by the hundreds and rush to the beach in attempt to save a stranded whale, a stranded dolphin. The fire brigade gets called out to rescue a cat stranded in a treetop. But to help a struggling newborn child clinging to the life, quote, "Doctor, don't you dare do such a thing," end quote. It's no wonder the Muslim nations call America the Great Satan, end quote. 1993, Akron versus Akron Center for Responsive Reproductive Health. This is not, in my lifetime. In a 6-3 ruling, the court struck down in Akron, Ohio, city ordinance requiring all abortions after the trimester period to be performed in hospitals after a 24-hour waiting period, and also struck down the provision in the same ordinance which required doctors to inform the woman contemplating abortion of the serious side effects, both medical and emotional, and that the, quote, fetus, end quote, that is the euphemism for a baby, is a living human being from the moment of conception. So why don't women who have abortions go to a regular hospital for the most serious medical procedures? The reason is that they want their child to be murdered in private, and they do not want hospital records, which can, under certain circumstances, be made public, testifying to what they have done. In other words, it's done in secret. This is why thousands of charnel houses, CHARNEL, house human butcher shops have sprung up like poison mushrooms all over the country. When a woman allows her infant child to be murdered, she wants the foul deed done in privacy, because it's already revealing that basically she's dead within her heart. That's my take on it. In 1986, the court reaffirmed Roe versus Wade ruling, and by a vote of 5-4 struck down a Pennsylvania, quote, informed consent, end quote, law mandating that women seeking abortion first be given counseling above the state of their unborn baby and their right to child support from the father, as well as the risks attached to abortion. Here again, the court grossly violates the 5th, the 9th, and the 10th Amendments. In 1992, Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. In a 5-4 vote, the court upheld Roe versus Wade, but did not refer to the alleged right as, quote, as fundamental, end quote, and struck down a state law which says that the husband or father of the child was to be notified before the women went ahead with the execution of her child. Here again, the Fifth Amendment right of the father and the infant were flagrantly violated by the Supreme Court, as was the 10th Amendment. And people say, why are you talking about this today? It's no longer the Roe versus Wade. That's been up, with Trump and all these other clowns, whatever. It needs to be talked about, folks. It just needs to be shared. Millions of people, many millions of babies have been slaughtered here in this country, folks. It's a scourge. It reveals a lot about this country. In 1993, Bray versus Alexandria Women's Health Clinic. In a 5-4 vote, the court ruled that a law which came into effect after the Civil War to control Ku Klux Klan activities could be invoked against demonstrators protesting outside of an abortion clinic. Congress later violated the Constitution by passing a, quote, law which held that freedom of access to, quote, clinics, end quote, could not be blocked. The so-called Freedom of Access to Clinics Act, end quote. Here again, the 10th Amendment was greatly violated. On January 24th, 1994, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a case brought by the National Organization of Women on behalf of 2 abortion charnel houses in Delaware and Ohio under the so-called RICO, R-I-C-O, end quote, statute, in itself 100% unconstitutional. By unanimously consent, the court held that RICO, the so-called federal government anti-racketeering law, could be invoked against demonstrators gathered outside a charnel house, that is a clinic, end quote, to protest the murder of infant children going on inside. In other words, what they're doing again here is they're trying to destroy the heart of the people. This is not something up here. This is, but it's to do with the heart. And people, when you become like those who ruled the world, that means you don't have a heart. You don't care. It's all over us. It's everywhere around us. People don't care. You know why they don't care? That's why it gets worse, folks. Because you don't care. You no longer have a heart. You're dead inside. This ruling is the worst anti-family pro-abortion ruling ever, handed down by the court, and should have long ago been overturned by the Congress. The mangled First Amendment rights of the protesters against child murder were thrown into the, quote, clinic's alley dumpster, along with the mangled remains of the murdered children. This was by far the most flagrant violation of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights since Roe versus Wade, and typify more than anything else what Jefferson wrote to Judge Johnson, which I quote earlier here from appendix in Congressional Record in June 30th of 1890. It echoes the warning given by Jefferson that justice of the Supreme Court would be the instrument for overriding states' rights. Of course it was. It was another case of the court, the states' rights, folks. It's not the federal government. The federal government has always been the fucking threat, okay? Always. It's not the states as much, okay? That's why the South was more states' rights. That's why they stood for what they stood for. You may not agree with that, and I don't, but the point simply is states have their own jurisdictions, their own rights, their own laws. It's another case of court legislating instead of the Congress, and Congress has thus far failed to do its duty by overturning this, quote, law, end quote. The Supreme Court ruling, in this case, nullify the right of citizens to gather for a peaceful demonstration, and it stifled the right of free speech by saying that anyone who protested outside of their charnel houses would be considered as engaging into racketeering. This is so ridiculous because they turned justice upside down. The court took no cognizance that its ruling grossly violated the 10th Amendment in an attempt to justify the convoluted reasoning. Justice Rehnquist wrote, acts such as the alleged extortion may not benefit the protesters financially, but may still drain money from the economy by harming business such as the clinics. So they're protecting the clinics and do the killing, you see. Wait a minute, excuse me, wait, what the fuck is going on here? What the hell? Excuse me, the clinics are there for death. Hello? You don't have a right to kill anybody, folks. You don't. If you do, you'll get punished for that. Usually, you either put to death, or either you put in jail forever. You're supposed to be, because you violated the right of another human being. But it's even worse when it's a child, a defenseless child, and how it took on. So that's the chapter 2. I'll stop there. Kind of rant and rant here, but frankly, I need to rant and rant sometimes, you know. And people say, well, it's no longer now. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that crap. Do you understand that President Trump, he did this to, quote unquote, get the votes from the Christians? That's right. He did that to actually to fool people as though he's conservative, so to speak. Well, you know, Roe versus Wade is no longer. Da, 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 da. What are you going to tell those millions and millions of children that basically have been killed? No one's dealt with that. How does that work out? Anyway, thank you for listening. Again, this is 2 chapters from Abortion, Genocide in America by John Coleman. And appreciate you listening. You have a good night and take care.